Hello and welcome. This video was created to help people relax or sleep with this in mind, and I only put 3 ads in the entire video. The stories in this video are allegedly true and actually happened. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel and like the video. Lastly, thank you for being here when you have so many other choices. Now let's begin. Emma was not an adventurer. Her weekends were usually spent curled up with a book or catching up on her favorite crime dramas. So when her childhood friend, Rachel, suggested a weekend camping trip in the forest, Emma hesitated. "It'll be fun," Rachel had insisted, her excitement contagious. "A break from the monotony, some fresh air, and we'll finally get to catch up. Just you, me, and a couple of friends." Emma reluctantly agreed. The thought of being surrounded by towering trees, disconnected from her phone and the comforts of her cozy apartment, was daunting. But she trusted Rachel. Besides, it was only 2 nights. How bad could it be? The forest they chose was about 3 hours away, nestled in a secluded area that promised pristine beauty and solitude. The drive was scenic, with winding roads cutting through endless greenery. By the time they arrived at the trailhead, the late afternoon sun bathed the forest in a golden glow. There were 4 of them: Emma, Rachel, Rachel's boyfriend Kyle, and his cousin Nate. The 2 men were experienced campers, carrying most of the gear and confidently leading the way into the woods. Emma trailed behind, her eyes darting to every rustle in the underbrush. "You okay back there?" Rachel asked, her voice light with amusement. "Yeah," Emma replied, though her grip on her backpack straps tightened. "Just getting used to it." The deeper they ventured, the quieter the world became. The hum of distant cars and the occasional chirp of a bird gave way to an eerie stillness. Even the wind seemed to hush, as if the forest was holding its breath. By the time they reached the clearing where they'd set up camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The trees around them stood tall and imposing, their branches tangled like skeletal fingers against the fading light. The group worked quickly to pitch their tents and gather firewood. The snap of twigs and the rhythmic pounding of tent stakes filled the air, grounding Emma in the normalcy of their tasks. By the time the fire crackled to life, casting flickering shadows on their faces, she began to relax. Kyle pulled out a small cooler, passing around cans of soda and sandwiches. Laughter echoed through the clearing as they swapped stories and teased one another. For the first time that day, Emma felt a spark of excitement. Maybe this trip wouldn't be so bad after all. But as the evening wore on, an unsettling sensation began to creep over her. It wasn't anything obvious, just a nagging feeling, like being watched. She scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, her eyes straining to pierce the shadows. The forest was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the fire. "You look tense," Nate said, nudging her. "First time camping?" Emma forced a smile. "Is it that obvious?" He chuckled. "Don't worry. The forest can seem intimidating at first, but it's just trees and critters. Nothing out there is gonna hurt you." His reassurance didn't help. If anything, it made her more aware of how vast and empty the woods were, and how small they were in the middle of it. Later, as the fire burned low and the group prepared for bed, Rachel nudged Emma. "Hey, thanks for coming. I know this isn't your thing, but it means a lot." Emma smiled, brushing off her unease. "It's fine. I'm glad to be here." But as she zipped herself into her tent, cocooned in a thin layer of nylon, the feeling of vulnerability returned. The darkness outside felt alive, pressing against the fabric. She could hear Rachel and Kyle murmuring in the next tent, their voices soft and reassuring. Nate was snoring already, his deep breaths a steady rhythm in the stillness. Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent. The sounds of the forest were different now, sharper. A faint rustle here, a distant snap there. She told herself it was just animals. But her heart raced with every noise, her mind conjuring images of glowing eyes and shadowy figures. And then she heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft, she almost convinced herself she imagined it. But then it came again, drifting through the night like a thread of smoke. Emma. Her blood ran cold. She sat up, clutching her sleeping bag. The whisper didn't come again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had called her name. She lay back down, her body tense, and stared at the ceiling until exhaustion finally pulled her into a restless sleep. And so begins our journey into the unknown. What was that whisper? Was it a trick of the wind, or something far more sinister? Stick around for part 2, where the forest's secrets begin to reveal themselves. If you're enjoying the story, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, sleep tight and watch the shadows. The morning came reluctantly, with a pale sun struggling to pierce the canopy above. Emma emerged from her tent, her muscles stiff and her eyes heavy with the weight of a restless night. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and moss. "Morning," Rachel greeted cheerfully, handing Emma a steaming cup of instant coffee. "Sleep okay?" Emma hesitated, then forced a smile. "Yeah, fine." She didn't mention the whisper. It felt silly now, in the light of day. The fire was already rekindled, and Kyle and Nate were busy cooking breakfast over the flames. The sizzle of bacon and the comforting warmth of the fire grounded Emma, easing some of the unease from the night before. As they ate, Nate unfolded a map and pointed to a trail nearby. "There's a creek about a mile from here. Good spot for fishing. We should check it out." The group agreed, packing a small bag with snacks and gear before setting off. The trail was narrow and overgrown, with branches clawing at their clothes as they passed. Emma stayed close to Rachel, her eyes darting to the shadows between the trees. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in patches, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. The creek, when they reached it, was picturesque. Clear water bubbled over smooth stones, and the air was alive with the sound of birds and insects. The group spread out, with Kyle and Nate setting up fishing rods while Rachel and Emma wandered along the bank. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" Rachel said, snapping pictures with her phone. Emma nodded, though her gaze kept drifting to the tree line. Something about the forest felt wrong. It wasn't just the whisper. It was the way the shadows seemed to linger too long, the way the air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing even though the sky was clear. "Earth to Emma," Rachel said, waving a hand in front of her face. "You're zoning out." "Sorry," Emma said, shaking her head. "Just thinking." Rachel grinned. "About what?" Emma hesitated. "Do you ever feel like you're being watched out here?" Rachel laughed. "That's just the forest. It plays tricks on you. All those stories about creepy woods and haunted cabins get in your head. Trust me, it's all in your imagination." Emma wanted to believe her. But as they walked back toward the group, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow slipping between the trees. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat, and stared into the woods. "Emma?" Rachel's voice pulled her back. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Emma said quickly. "I thought I saw something, but it's nothing." Rachel frowned, but didn't press. They rejoined Kyle and Nate, who were packing up their gear after a successful catch. The group headed back to camp, their laughter echoing through the trees. By the time they returned, the sun was sinking low in the sky. They spent the evening preparing dinner, roasting the fish over the fire. The scent was mouth-watering, and for a while, Emma felt a semblance of normalcy. The warmth of the flames and the camaraderie of her friends pushed the unease to the back of her mind. As the night deepened, Kyle suggested they share ghost stories. Rachel rolled her eyes but played along, recounting an old urban legend about a hitchhiker who disappeared without a trace. Nate followed with a tale about a haunted lighthouse. When it was Emma's turn, she hesitated. "I don't really have any ghost stories," she said. "Not real ones, anyway." "Come on," Nate teased. "You've got to have something." Emma shrugged. "Okay, there's this one. When I was a kid, my mom told me about this local legend. A woman who lived in the woods. People said she could steal your voice if you called out to her. She'd mimic it, lure you deeper into the forest, and then you'd vanish. They called her the Echo Woman." The group fell silent for a moment, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Then Rachel laughed nervously. "Creepy. Where did your mom hear that?" "No idea," Emma said. "Probably just something to keep kids from wandering off." "Still," Nate said, poking at the fire with a stick, "makes you wonder how stories like that start." The conversation drifted to lighter topics, but Emma's thoughts lingered on the story. She hadn't thought about the Echo Woman in years, but the memory felt disturbingly relevant now. That night, the forest came alive with sounds. Emma lay in her tent, listening to the distant hoot of an owl and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. She told herself it was normal, that there was nothing to fear, but the unease wouldn't leave her. Then she heard it again, a whisper. This time, it wasn't her name. It was soft and unintelligible, like the wind carrying fragments of a conversation. Emma sat up, her pulse racing. She strained her ears, but the whispering stopped. She lay back down, her body tense. Minutes passed, then hours. Just as she was starting to drift off, a sound jolted her awake, a faint, deliberate tapping on the outside of her tent. Tap, tap, tap. Emma froze, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate, and then silence. The night stretched on, heavy and oppressive. When morning finally came, Emma wasn't sure she had slept at all. The morning sun was muted, veiled by a thick layer of gray clouds. Emma stepped out of her tent, her skin prickling with the chill of the air, and something else. An unshakable feeling that lingered from the night before. She scanned the camp, her eyes darting to the trees, but everything seemed ordinary, peaceful even. Kyle and Nate were already at the fire, boiling water for coffee. Rachel was stretching, her yoga mat spread out on the dewy grass. "Rough night?" Kyle asked, handing Emma a mug. Emma nodded, her fingers wrapping around the warm cup. "Yeah, didn't sleep much." Rachel shot her a concerned look. "You're still on edge. Did something happen?" Emma hesitated, debating whether to tell them about the tapping. "It's probably nothing, just weird noises." "Welcome to the great outdoors," Nate joked, his grin wide. "Nature has its own soundtrack, you know." Emma forced a laugh, but the unease gnawed at her. She glanced toward the tree line again. Something about the forest felt wrong. The shadows seemed darker, the trees closer together. "Let's do something today," Rachel said, breaking the tension. "Hiking, exploring, anything to get moving." The group agreed, packing a day's worth of supplies and setting off down a nearby trail. The path was narrow and winding, cutting through dense undergrowth. The air was damp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and decay. Birds chirped sporadically, their calls sharp against the silence of the woods. Emma lagged behind, her eyes scanning the trees. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was a certainty, like an itch she couldn't scratch. Every so often she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision. a shadow slipping between the trees, a branch swaying without wind. "Hey, you good back there?" Rachel called, her voice cutting through the stillness. Emma forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. She felt like the forest was alive, its gaze fixed on her. As the trail curved uphill, the group stumbled upon an old wooden signpost. The lettering was faded and weathered, but the word Ash Hollow was just legible. "Creepy," Nate said, tapping the sign with a stick. "Sounds like the setting for a horror movie." "Let's check it out," Rachel said, already heading in the direction the sign pointed. Emma hesitated. "Maybe we should stick to the main trail." "Come on," Kyle said. "Where's your sense of adventure?" Reluctantly, Emma followed. The path grew narrower, the trees thicker. The air seemed heavier here, charged with an unspoken tension. The group's chatter dwindled as the silence pressed in around them. They came upon a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls warped and gray with age. Vines crawled up its sides, and the windows were dark and empty. "Whoa," Nate said, his voice hushed. "This is straight out of a horror story." "Should we check it out?" Rachel asked, already moving toward the cabin. Emma's stomach twisted. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Oh, come on," Rachel said, her tone light. "It's just an old cabin. What's the worst that could happen?" As Rachel pushed open the door, it creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the clearing. The inside was dark, the air thick with the smell of rot and mildew. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they stepped inside. The cabin was small, with a single room and a crumbling fireplace. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like tattered curtains. On the far wall, a faded photograph hung crookedly, its glass cracked. "Creepy," Kyle muttered, moving closer to the photograph. It depicted a family, a man, a woman, and a young girl. Their faces were blurred, as if smeared by time. "This place gives me the creeps," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. As if on cue, a sound echoed from somewhere outside. A faint, hollow whistle. The group froze, their eyes darting to the doorway. "Probably just the wind," Nate said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emma stepped back, her heart pounding. "We should leave, now." Rachel hesitated, her gaze lingering on the photograph. Then she nodded. "Okay, let's go." The group hurried back to the trail, their earlier excitement replaced by an uneasy silence. Emma kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following them. When they finally returned to camp, the sky was darkening, the sun sinking behind the trees. The fire was a welcome sight, its warm glow pushing back the encroaching shadows. They sat around the flames, eating in silence. The usual banter was gone, replaced by a heavy tension. Even Nate, the eternal optimist, seemed subdued. "What do you think that cabin was?" Rachel asked finally, breaking the silence. "Abandoned," Kyle said. "Probably for decades." "Yeah, but why?" Rachel pressed. "People don't just leave places like that." "Maybe they do," Emma said quietly. "If they're afraid of something." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but no one responded. That night the forest was deathly silent. Emma lay awake, her ears straining for any sound. The whispering hadn't returned, but the stillness was almost worse. It felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. And then she heard it, a soft rustling just outside her tent. Emma froze, her heart pounding. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside. She held her breath, her body rigid with fear. Then came the whisper. Emma. Her name, drawn out and hollow, as if spoken from far away. But it wasn't far away. It was right there, on the other side of the thin fabric of her tent. Tears welled in her eyes as she clamped a hand over her mouth, stifling a sob. The whisper came again, closer this time. And then, silence. Emma didn't move, didn't breathe, until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. Morning brought little relief. The group sat around the dying embers of the fire, their faces drawn and pale. None of them had slept well, though Emma was certain her night had been the worst. She kept the details of the whispers to herself, unsure how to explain what she'd heard, or why it had called her name. "We should head back to the car today," Emma said, breaking the silence. "This place doesn't feel right." Kyle frowned. "You're overthinking it. It's just the woods. Creepy, sure, but that's the charm of camping." "No!" Emma snapped, surprising herself with the force of her words. "Something's wrong here. You felt it in that cabin, didn't you? You all did." Rachel nodded reluctantly, her eyes darting to the trees. She's right. That place felt off, and the woods last night, they were too quiet. Nate, ever the skeptic, sighed. "All right, let's say something weird is going on. What are we supposed to do? Run back to the car like scared kids?" "Yes," Emma said firmly. "Exactly that." Despite Emma's insistence, the group decided to stay for one more day. "If it gets too bad, we'll pack up tonight," Kyle offered, trying to calm her. But Emma knew they were making a mistake. They spent the morning gathering wood and tidying the campsite, trying to shake the lingering unease. As Emma ventured to the edge of the clearing to collect branches, she felt the hairs on her neck stand on end. That's when she saw it. A mark carved into the bark of a tree, a symbol she didn't recognize. It looked ancient, jagged lines intersecting to form a crude shape. The edges of the carving were blackened, as if burned into the wood. Emma's stomach churned. She touched the mark, her fingers brushing the rough grooves. The bark felt warm, almost alive, and she snatched her hand back as if burned. "What's wrong?" Rachel's voice startled her. Emma turned to see her friend standing a few feet away, holding an armful of sticks. "Look," she said, pointing to the symbol. Rachel frowned, stepping closer. "What is that?" "I don't know," Emma whispered, "but it's not normal." Back at the camp, Emma showed the others a rough sketch of the symbol she'd made in her notebook. Kyle squinted at it, his expression unreadable. "Looks like some kind of rune," he said. Rachel shook her head. "I've seen runes before. This is different." Nate leaned back, crossing his arms. "Maybe it's just graffiti. Some bored kid messing around with a knife." "Do you think a kid burned it into the tree too?" Emma shot back. Nate shrugged, but his confident facade was cracking. "So what are you saying? That it's cursed or something?" "I don't know," Emma admitted, "but I think it's connected to this place, to that cabin." The day dragged on, tension hanging thick in the air. By afternoon, the sky had darkened, heavy clouds blotting out the sun. A cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying the faint scent of rain. The group huddled around the fire, their conversation strained and fragmented. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made them jump. Emma couldn't stop thinking about the symbol. It felt burned into her mind, a dark imprint she couldn't shake. She kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see another mark, or worse, something watching her. As night fell, the group decided to call it an early evening. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, and even Nate seemed eager to retreat to his tent. But Emma couldn't sleep. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling of the tent, every nerve on edge. Her mind replayed the events of the day, the mark on the tree, the whispers, the cabin. And then she heard it again, a faint rustling outside her tent. Her breath hitched, her body tensing. She reached for her flashlight, gripping it tightly. The rustling grew louder, closer, and then came the voice, Emma. Her heart stopped. It was the same hollow whisper from the night before, but this time it was accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps. Emma, come out. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands trembling. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Emma, we see you. Her mind screamed for her to run, to scream, but her body refused to move. Then, as suddenly as it began, the whisper stopped. The next morning, Emma was the first to emerge from her tent. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. The others joined her one by one, their expressions mirroring her unease. We're leaving, she said firmly, not waiting for their input. Pack up, now. No one argued. As they dismantled the camp, Emma caught sight of something on the edge of the clearing, a new mark carved into a tree. It was the same symbol she'd seen the day before, but this time it was accompanied by a single word, scratched deeply into the bark. Stay. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed her backpack and started walking, not caring if the others followed. Behind her, the forest seemed to watch, its shadows shifting and whispering as the group made their way back to the trail. The group moved quickly, their boots crunching against the damp forest floor. The morning air was heavy with moisture, and the sky remained an ominous gray, as though the sun had given up trying to break through. No one spoke much as they trudged along the trail. Emma led the way, her eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement in the trees. The carved word, stay, was burned into her mind, a warning she couldn't ignore. But something felt wrong. After what felt like hours of walking, Emma paused. The trail beneath her feet seemed familiar, too familiar. She turned to the others, her heart pounding. Have we passed this spot before? She asked, pointing to a fallen tree with a moss-covered trunk. Kyle frowned, glancing around. I don't think so. It's just trees. They all look the same after a while. No, Rachel said quietly, her voice trembling. She's right. I remember that tree. It had that weird hollow near the base. Emma's stomach churned. We're going in circles. The realization sent a wave of unease through the group. They checked their phones, but there was no signal. The GPS wouldn't load, and even the compass app on Kyle's phone seemed to glitch, the arrow spinning erratically. This doesn't make any sense, Nate muttered, shaking the device. How are we lost? The trail's right here. Emma felt the panic rising in her chest. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Let's just keep moving. Maybe we missed a turnoff. But as they pressed on, the feeling of familiarity grew stronger. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees denser, the air heavier. The trail, once a clear path, now felt like a maze. By midday, the group was exhausted and on edge. They stopped to rest near a cluster of boulders, their faces pale and drawn. We need to mark where we've been, Rachel suggested. She picked up a sharp stone and scratched an X into one of the boulders. There. If we pass this again, we'll know for sure. The others nodded, their expressions grim. As they set off again, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest was too quiet, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves replaced by an oppressive silence. Hours later, they came upon the boulders again. Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. Number no, this isn't possible. The X she had carved was still there, glaring back at them like a cruel joke. Kyle kicked at the dirt in frustration. This is insane. We've been walking straight. How are we back here? Emma felt a cold dread settle over her. The forest wasn't just a place anymore. It was a presence, alive and aware of their every move. We have to go back to the cabin, she said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. What? Nate snapped. Are you out of your mind? That place is the last place we should go. Emma met his gaze, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "The forest is messing with us. It's keeping us here. That cabin might have answers, or at least a way out." Reluctantly, the group turned back toward the direction of the cabin, though none of them were entirely sure where it was. The trail seemed to shift beneath their feet, leading them one way, then another. As dusk fell, the forest grew darker, the shadows stretching and twisting unnaturally. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. And then the whispers began again. At first they were faint, barely audible over the crunch of their footsteps. But as the light faded, the voices grew louder, surrounding them. "Turn back. Stay with us. Emma!" Her name was the loudest, cutting through the others like a blade. Emma clenched her fists, refusing to show her fear. "We're almost there," she said, though she wasn't sure if it was true. When the cabin finally came into view, it was like a punch to the gut. The group stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring at the dilapidated structure. It looked worse than before. The roof sagged in the middle, and the windows were dark and hollow. But what struck Emma the most was the door. It was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. "I don't like this," Rachel whispered, clutching her arms. "We don't have a choice," Emma replied. Kyle stepped forward, his jaw tight. "All right, let's make this quick." Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. The cabin felt colder than it should, as if the temperature had dropped the moment they crossed the threshold. Emma's flashlight illuminated the same eerie carvings they had seen before, etched into the walls and floor. But now, there were more of them, spiraling outward in chaotic patterns. "What is this place?" Rachel murmured, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Emma replied. Her eyes were drawn to the center of the room, where the floorboards were darker, as if stained by something. A low creak echoed through the cabin, and the group froze. The door slammed shut. The whispers erupted, louder and more chaotic than ever. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, the carvings glowing faintly in the darkness. "Get out!" Kyle shouted, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Emma felt a strange pull, her body drawn toward the center of the room. She dropped to her knees, her fingers brushing the dark stain on the floor. A voice, deep and guttural, cut through the chaos. "You should not have come back." The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. The group stood frozen in the cabin, their breathing shallow and rapid. The air felt charged, heavy with an energy that made Emma's skin prickle. "What was that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Emma didn't answer. She was transfixed by the stain on the floor, her fingers still brushing its surface. It was sticky, and the faint metallic tang of blood filled her nostrils. "Emma, get up," Kyle said sharply, grabbing her arm. But as he pulled her back, something happened. The stain began to spread, dark tendrils creeping outward like veins, snaking across the floorboards. The carvings on the walls and ceiling glowed brighter, their shapes twisting into something unrecognizable. And then the ground beneath them began to vibrate. "Out! We need to get out now!" Nate shouted, shoving against the door. The door wouldn't budge, no matter how hard they pushed or kicked. The windows, once fragile and broken, were now sealed with thick, impenetrable darkness. The glow from the carvings intensified, casting eerie shadows across the room. Emma's gaze darted to the far corner, where something caught her eye, a small trap door, partially hidden beneath a pile of rotting wood. "There!" she yelled, pointing. "The trap door!" The group scrambled toward it, Kyle and Nate tossing aside the debris. Beneath, the trapdoor was covered in the same strange carvings, but it looked intact. Rachel hesitated. What if it's worse down there? Emma didn't answer. She grabbed the rusted handle and yanked it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was frigid, carrying a smell of damp earth and something faintly sweet, like decaying flowers. "We don't have a choice," Emma said, her voice trembling. One by one, they climbed down the creaking stairs, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the suffocating darkness. The walls of the tunnel were damp and close, pressing in on them like the forest itself had followed them underground. The whispers returned, faint and indistinct at first, then growing louder with each step. They weren't just voices anymore. They were sobs, screams, and something else, laughter. Emma felt her pulse quicken. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the earth. The carvings continued here, etched into the dirt walls, glowing faintly in the darkness. "What is this place?" Nate muttered, his voice echoing eerily. "It's old," Rachel said, her flashlight catching a carving that looked like a crude figure. Like ancient. The tunnel ended abruptly, opening into a large underground chamber. The air was colder here, and the floor was slick with moisture. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark. Surrounding it were more carvings, spiraling outward in intricate, dizzying patterns. But what drew Emma's attention was what lay on the altar, a bundle of rags tied with frayed rope. "What is that?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. Emma approached cautiously, her flashlight trembling in her hand. As she drew closer, she realized the bundle wasn't just rags. It was a body, small and fragile, wrapped tightly and long decayed. "Oh my God," Kyle whispered, backing away. The air grew heavier, the whispers louder. The carvings on the walls began to pulse with light, casting the room in an otherworldly glow. And then, the laughter came again. The sound was deep and guttural, reverberating through the chamber. It wasn't human. It was something far older, far darker. "You have come to the heart," the voice said, its words slithering into their minds. "And now you will know." The walls seemed to ripple, and the air itself grew thick, pressing against their lungs. Emma staggered back, clutching her chest. "What do you want?" she managed to choke out. The laughter stopped. "What do I want?" The voice repeated mockingly. "I want what was promised. Blood for the forest. Life for the land." The group exchanged panicked glances. "What does that mean?" Nate demanded, his voice cracking. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the bundle on the altar began to move, the ropes straining as something writhed beneath them. Emma stumbled back, her flashlight falling to the ground. The rope snapped and the figure sat up. It wasn't human. Not anymore. Its hollow eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its skeletal hands reached out toward them. "You should have stayed away," it rasped, its voice echoing with the same guttural tone as the laughter. Rachel screamed, and the group turned to run, but the tunnel they had come through was gone, replaced by solid earth. The creature stepped down from the altar, its movements jerky and unnatural. The carvings on the walls pulsed faster, the light almost blinding. Emma felt the pull again, stronger this time. Her body moved of its own accord, dragging her toward the center of the room. "No! Emma, fight it!" Kyle shouted, grabbing her arm. But it was no use. The force was too strong. She stumbled forward, her knees hitting the cold stone floor. "Why me?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The voice laughed again. "Because you are the one who opened the door. You are the one who awakened us." The ground beneath the altar began to crack, a deep red light spilling out. The chamber shook violently, and the air was filled with a deafening roar. Emma's mind raced, desperate for a way out. She looked back at her friends, their faces pale with terror. "We have to break the carvings," she shouted, the words coming to her instinctively. Kyle and Nate didn't hesitate. They grabbed whatever they could find, rocks, pieces of wood, and began smashing at the glowing patterns on the walls. The creature screamed, its voice a cacophony of rage and pain. It lunged toward Rachel, but she ducked, slamming a rock into one of the carvings. The light dimmed, and the chamber began to collapse. "Keep going!" Emma yelled, her own hands clawing at the nearest carving. The creature writhed, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You cannot escape," it hissed. "The forest will never let you go." With one final strike, the last carving shattered, and the chamber was plunged into darkness. The whispers stopped, and the air grew still. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the ground beneath them gave way, and they fell. The fall seemed endless. The darkness around them was impenetrable, swallowing their screams and the frantic thuds of their bodies colliding with unseen surfaces. Emma felt the air rush past her, cold and damp, until she finally hit something soft but unyielding. The landing knocked the wind out of her. For a moment, she lay still, gasping, her ears ringing. Then, a groan echoed from somewhere nearby. "Is everyone okay?" Emma croaked, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her chest. "I think so," Kyle muttered, his voice strained. Where are we?" Emma fumbled for her flashlight, but it was cracked and useless. The faint glow from Nate's flashlight flickered on, revealing their surroundings. They were in a cavernous space, its walls slick with moisture and covered in the same pulsating carvings. The air was colder here, carrying a sickly sweet smell that turned Emma's stomach. The floor beneath them was a strange, spongy material that seemed to give slightly under their weight. "I don't like this," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. The group huddled close, their flashlights barely cutting through the oppressive gloom. The walls seemed to close in, the carvings glowing faintly like malevolent eyes watching their every move. "We need to find a way out," Nate said, his voice firm but laced with fear. They began to move cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the strange ground. The cavern twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the earth. The air grew heavier with each step, the oppressive energy pressing against their chests. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Shadows flickered at the edges of the flashlight beams, and the whispers began again, soft, indistinct, but unmistakable. "Do you hear that?" Rachel asked, clutching Nate's arm. "It's just in our heads," Kyle said, though his voice betrayed his doubt. Emma stopped suddenly, her breath hitching. "No, it's not." She pointed ahead, where a figure stood in the distance. It was tall and impossibly thin, its body swaying unnaturally as though caught in an unseen wind. Its face was featureless, save for two glowing eyes that burned like embers. The whispers grew louder. "Run," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure moved. It didn't walk. It glided, its movements smooth and predatory. The group turned and bolted, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they stumbled through the twisting passages. The whispers followed, growing into a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Keep moving," Nate shouted, his voice hoarse. Emma's lungs burned, and her legs felt like lead, but she didn't stop. The figure was gaining on them, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. They rounded a corner and came to a dead end, a massive stone door covered in intricate carvings. "No, no, no!" Rachel cried, pounding on the door. "Help me push it!" Kyle yelled, shoving against the heavy stone. Emma joined him, her hands slipping on the cold surface. The door didn't budge. The figure was close now, its whispers turning into guttural growls. Emma turned, her back pressed against the door, and raised her flashlight. The light hit the figure, and for a moment it recoiled, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Use the lights," Emma shouted. The others followed her lead, shining their flashlights at the creature. It shrieked, the sound piercing and inhuman, and retreated slightly, its form flickering like a shadow in the wind. "Keep it back!" Nate yelled, his flashlight beam shaking as he aimed it at the figure. Emma's eyes darted to the carvings on the door. They were similar to the ones in the chamber above, but these were different, more detailed, more purposeful. Her fingers traced the symbols, her mind racing. These carvings, they're a key. "What are you talking about?" Kyle asked, glancing nervously at the creature. "We need to press them in the right order," Emma said, her voice urgent. The creature shrieked again, surging forward. Rachel screamed, but Nate stepped in front of her, his flashlight blazing. "Hurry!" Nate shouted. Emma's fingers flew over the carvings, pressing them one by one. She didn't know how she knew the sequence. It was as if the symbols were speaking to her, guiding her hands. The ground shook, and the door began to vibrate. The carvings glowed brighter, their light spilling out into the cavern. The creature howled, its form distorting as the light from the door intensified. "Almost there!" Emma yelled, pressing the final symbol. The door groaned, then slid open with a deafening rumble. Light poured out, blinding and warm, driving the creature back into the shadows. "Go! Now!" Emma shouted, grabbing Rachel's arm and pulling her through the opening. The group stumbled into the light, the warmth washing over them like a wave. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the creature's anguished cries. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. The space they had entered was different, calm, quiet, and bathed in a soft golden glow. What is this place?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Emma didn't answer. She was staring at the walls, which were covered in carvings that seemed to tell a story of the forest, the creature, and the sacrifices made to keep it contained. "We're not safe yet," Emma said, her voice heavy. The others looked at her, their faces pale and exhausted. "What do you mean?" Kyle asked. Emma pointed to a section of the carvings, her finger trembling. "The door didn't destroy it. It only bought us time." The group fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The light around them flickered, and the whispers began to creep back in. The nightmare wasn't over. Not yet. The warm glow of the chamber offered a fleeting sense of safety, but Emma couldn't shake the unease coiling in her chest. The carvings on the walls told a story she couldn't fully comprehend. Shapes of humans bowing before the creature, strange symbols swirling around a central figure that seemed to hold the creature at bay. "Do you hear that?" Rachel whispered, clutching her arms as though trying to shield herself from the unseen. The whispers had returned, faint but persistent, like a breath brushing against their ears. They came from everywhere and nowhere, setting Emma's teeth on edge. "We can't stay here," Nate said, his voice resolute. "If that thing isn't gone, we need to find a way to stop it." Emma pointed at the carvings. "I think this place was built to contain it. Look, these symbols, they're wards or seals." Kyle frowned, squinting at the walls. "Then why is it still out there? Did something break the seal?" "Maybe," Emma said. "Or maybe we did when we came here." A deep, resonant hum echoed through the chamber, silencing them all. The light flickered, dimming as shadows stretched across the walls. "Something's coming," Rachel whimpered, gripping Nate's arm. The group instinctively huddled together, their flashlights scanning the room. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground, until a voice boomed from the darkness. "You should not be here." The voice was low and ancient, each word heavy with authority. From the far end of the chamber, a figure emerged, a tall, cloaked being with a face obscured by a hood. Its presence was commanding, yet it didn't evoke the same terror as the creature. "Who are you?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "I am the keeper," the figure replied, its voice echoing unnaturally. "The guardian of this place and the prison that holds the shadow." "The shadow?" Kyle asked, his brow furrowed. "The being you have unleashed," the keeper said, its tone sharp. "It is ancient and insatiable, bound here long ago by those who understood its power. Your intrusion has weakened the seals, and now it seeks to break free." Emma stepped forward, her hands trembling. "We didn't mean to. We just wanted to camp. We didn't know this place was here." "Intentions matter little," the keeper said, its voice cold. "What matters is what you will do now. If the shadow escapes this place, it will consume everything." "How do we stop it?" Nate asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The keeper gestured to the carvings on the walls. "The seals must be restored. The symbols are a map, a guide to the ritual that will bind it once more." Emma's eyes scanned the carvings, her mind racing. "But how? We don't know the ritual, and we don't have time." The keeper raised a hand, silencing her. "You have no choice. The shadow grows stronger with each passing moment. If you do not act, it will break free." The ground shook violently, and a deep guttural roar echoed through the chamber. The group froze as the sound reverberated through their bones. "It's here," the keeper said, its voice grim. "You must begin." The group scrambled to study the carvings, their flashlights flickering as the room grew colder. The symbols were intricate, spiraling across the walls in a chaotic dance. Emma traced her fingers over the patterns, her breath quickening. These look like the ones on the door. It's a sequence." "Start there," the keeper urged, pointing to a glowing symbol on the far wall. "You must activate them in the correct order." Rachel hesitated, her hands shaking. "What if we get it wrong?" "Then you will perish," the keeper said simply. Emma swallowed hard and stepped forward, pressing the first symbol. It lit up, glowing with an eerie blue light. She moved to the next, her hands guided by instinct, or perhaps by the whispers that now seemed to hum in harmony with the carvings. The chamber trembled as each symbol was activated, the air growing heavier with each step. The glow spread across the walls, connecting the symbols in intricate patterns. But as the light grew, so did the shadow's presence. Its guttural growls echoed through the chamber, and the whispers turned into angry, distorted voices. "Hurry!" Nate shouted, his flashlight flickering wildly. Emma's hands flew over the symbols, her heart pounding. The final one was just within reach when the shadow appeared. It surged into the chamber, a mass of darkness that twisted and writhed like a living nightmare. Its glowing eyes locked onto Emma, and it let out a deafening roar. "Keep it back!" Kyle yelled, shining his flashlight at the creature. The others followed suit, their beams piercing the darkness and forcing the shadow to recoil. But it didn't retreat. It pushed forward, its form flickering and shifting as though it were struggling against an invisible force. Emma pressed the final symbol. The chamber erupted in light, blinding and searing. The shadow howled, its form writhing as the seals reactivated. The glowing patterns spread across the walls, encasing the creature in a cage of light. The keeper raised its hands, chanting in a language that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The seals pulsed, drawing the shadow back into the depths of the cavern. "It is done," the keeper said as the light began to fade. The group collapsed to the ground, their breaths ragged. The chamber was silent once more, the oppressive energy lifted. Did we stop it?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now," the keeper said. "But the seals are fragile. If they are broken again, the shadow will return, stronger than before." Emma looked at the keeper, her eyes filled with determination. "We'll make sure no one ever comes here again." The keeper nodded, its form beginning to fade. Leave this place and never return. The forest will protect what remains. The group stumbled out of the chamber, the weight of their ordeal pressing heavily on their shoulders. As they emerged into the cold night air, the stars above seemed impossibly bright, a stark contrast to the darkness they had left behind. But even as they walked away, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching, its secrets still buried beneath the surface. And deep below, the shadow waited. The group moved through the forest in a tense silence, their flashlights casting trembling beams over the gnarled trees. The once familiar woods now felt alien, as though the forest itself was alive and aware of their presence. "Do you think it's really over?" Rachel asked, her voice barely audible over the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Emma hesitated, glancing over her shoulder at the darkness they had left behind. "The keeper said the seals are fragile. If someone stumbles across that place again..." She trailed off, the weight of her words sinking into the group. "We need to report this," Nate said. "To someone. Authorities, researchers, anyone who can help keep people out of here." Kyle shook his head. "And what do we say? That we found a cave with an ancient monster and a disappearing guardian? They'll think we're insane." Rachel wrapped her arms around herself, her breath visible in the frigid air. "So what do we do? Just leave it? Pretend it never happened?" Emma stopped abruptly, turning to face the group. "Number, we can't pretend. We have to do something. But right now, we need to get out of this forest." The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. Emma froze, her flashlight beam darting through the trees. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Nate nodded, his jaw tight. "It's the same sound from before." Rachel whimpered, her grip tightening on Nate's arm. "It's following us. The shadow. It's not gone." "No," Emma said firmly. "It's bound again. This is something else." The group huddled closer, their flashlights flickering as the whispers grew louder. The voices were indistinct, overlapping in a chaotic murmur that seemed to come from all directions. "Keep moving," Emma urged, her voice trembling. They pressed on, the path ahead barely visible in the dim light. The forest seemed to shift around them, the trees growing denser, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. The whispers grew into a cacophony, the words still unintelligible, but filled with malice. Suddenly, Rachel screamed, stumbling backward. "What is it?" Nate demanded, catching her before she fell. She pointed ahead, her hand shaking. "There! In the trees!" Emma squinted, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At first, she saw nothing. But then a figure emerged, a shadowy silhouette standing motionless among the trees. Its shape was human, but its edges flickered like smoke, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. "It's watching us," Kyle whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, distorting the space like a heat wave. "We need to go," Emma said, her voice low and urgent. "Now." They broke into a run, the whispers chasing them like a living thing. The forest closed in around them, the trees forming a labyrinth of twisting paths. No matter how far they ran, the whispers stayed close, their tone shifting from angry to mocking, as though the forest itself was taunting them. Emma's lungs burned as she pushed forward, her flashlight flickering wildly. She could hear Rachel sobbing behind her, Kyle's heavy breaths, and Nate's muttered curses. "This isn't the way we came," Nate shouted, his voice panicked. "It's the forest," Emma yelled back. "It's trying to keep us here." They stumbled into a clearing, the sudden openness startling them. The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. The group collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. For a moment, the stillness felt almost peaceful, but Emma's instincts screamed that something was wrong. "This isn't right," she said, her voice trembling. Rachel looked up, her face pale and tear-streaked. "What do you mean?" Emma scanned the clearing, her flashlight beam revealing nothing but grass and scattered leaves. "The forest doesn't want us to leave, it's playing with us." Kyle groaned, his head in his hands. "What does it want? Why doesn't it just let us go?" Before Emma could answer, the ground beneath them began to tremble. A low, rumbling growl echoed through the clearing, and the grass around them began to wither, turning brown and brittle. The air grew cold, and a foul stench filled their nostrils, like rotting meat. From the edge of the clearing, shadows began to pool, forming a dark mass that writhed and twisted. The glow of two eyes appeared within the darkness, burning like embers. "It's the shadow!" Rachel screamed, scrambling backward. "No!" Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's something else." The shadowy mass surged forward, stopping just short of the group. It didn't attack. Instead, it loomed over them, its presence suffocating. The whispers returned, louder now, forming a single coherent word: "Leave." The word echoed through their minds, not just their ears, as though the forest itself was speaking to them. The shadowy mass pulsed, its form flickering and shifting. Emma forced herself to stand, her legs trembling. "We're trying to leave," she shouted, her voice breaking. "But you won't let us." The shadow paused, its eyes narrowing. For a moment the clearing was silent. Then the mass began to recede, melting back into the forest. The whispers faded, replaced by a faint, almost melodic hum. A path opened before them, the trees bending away to reveal a clear trail. Is it letting us go?" Kyle asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Emma didn't answer. She simply started walking, her flashlight steady as she led the group down the path. The trail seemed endless, but the oppressive feeling began to lift. The air grew warmer, the trees less menacing. And then, finally, they saw it. The edge of the forest, bathed in the soft light of dawn. Relief washed over them as they stumbled out of the woods, the open sky above feeling like a miracle. But as they turned to look back, the forest seemed to watch them, its shadows deep and impenetrable. "We're out," Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We're out." Emma nodded, but her gaze lingered on the tree line. The forest had let them go, but its warning was clear. The shadow was contained, for now. The morning light spilled across the open field as the group stepped away from the edge of the forest, their breaths still heavy from the terror of the past few hours. They hadn't spoken much since they left the woods, the silence thick with the weight of their shared experience. The forest, dark and brooding behind them, felt like an old memory they couldn't shake, a nightmare that had followed them into the daylight. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. It wasn't just the lingering fear or the strange heaviness in her chest. It was the quiet, almost unnatural calmness of the forest behind them. "We need to report this," Rachel said, her voice raw. "People need to know what's out there." Nate, his face pale and drawn, nodded slowly. "Yeah, but what do we even say? That there's some kind of ancient monster? That it talks to you through the trees? People will think we're crazy." Emma glanced back at the forest, its shadows still lurking just beyond the sunlight. "I don't think anyone would believe us, even if we did. The forest, it has its way of making you doubt everything you saw." "I don't care what people think," Rachel snapped, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm not going back in there, and I don't want anyone else to." "Agreed," Kyle said quietly, rubbing his temples. "I think we've all had enough." Emma turned away from the group, walking slowly toward the dirt road that led out of the forest. The others followed, but her mind was elsewhere. There was a nagging thought that she couldn't quite shake, a question that had been growing in the back of her mind since they'd left the cave. What if it wasn't just the keeper who was bound by the forest's will? What if there was something older, something darker, at play here? The group walked in silence for several minutes, the distant hum of a car engine growing louder as they approached the road. But Emma's mind was far from the mundane. The forest hadn't let them go so easily. They had been given a path to escape, but had it truly been their choice? Or had the forest allowed them to leave, only to return another time when it was ready? Her thoughts were interrupted when Nate suddenly stopped in his tracks, his eyes fixed on something ahead. "What is it?" Rachel asked, voice tight. Emma's gaze followed Nate's, and her heart skipped a beat. At the end of the road, just where the trees began to recede, there stood a figure. A tall, cloaked figure, silhouetted against the bright morning light. "Who's that?" Kyle asked, his voice strained. The figure didn't move, standing still like a shadow from a nightmare. Emma's blood ran cold as she realized something. It was the keeper. But this time, it wasn't a man. It was something else. The figure took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate. The forest behind it seemed to darken, the trees bending as though in response. Emma's mind raced. Was this the keeper, or something far worse? "What do you want?" Rachel shouted, stepping forward. "We're done. We've had enough." But the figure didn't respond. It simply raised one hand, palm open, as if beckoning them closer. The whispering voices from the forest, once distant, grew louder in their ears, calling to them with a strange, haunting rhythm. "Don't go near it," Emma warned, her voice barely above a whisper. But it was too late. Nate, with a look of vacant curiosity in his eyes, took a hesitant step toward the figure. "Nate!" Kyle shouted, grabbing his arm. "What are you doing?" Nate didn't respond. His eyes were wide and glazed over, his body moving almost of its own accord. The figure's hand twitched, and a cold wind swept across the road, biting at their skin. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices filling their minds. Emma's head spun, the sounds almost unbearable. "Stop!" she cried, rushing forward to pull Nate away. But as her hand touched his arm, the world around them shifted. The ground beneath their feet seemed to ripple like water, the road warping and bending. The trees at the edge of the forest began to twist, their trunks stretching upward, their branches contorting into grotesque shapes. The whispers turned into guttural growls, and the figure, no longer human, extended its other hand toward them. It was a creature of shadows, its form flickering and shifting like smoke. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, a sickly green that burned through the air. Emma pulled Nate back, but his body felt cold, lifeless. "Nate!" she screamed. "Snap out of it!" His eyes, now empty and devoid of recognition, turned to her. "It's too late," he whispered. "We can't leave. It's already inside." The world around them seemed to close in, the trees stretching toward them, the figure looming larger. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the shadows began to crawl toward her, tendrils of darkness reaching for her like hungry hands. "No," Emma whispered, her heart pounding. "No." She turned to the others, her mind racing. They had to fight back. But how? And then, just as the shadows closed in, a piercing, blinding light cut through the darkness. The figure screamed, its form flickering and writhing as the light enveloped it. The shadows recoiled, retreating back into the trees. The whispers ceased, and the world around them stilled. For a moment, everything was quiet. The light faded, revealing the keeper once more, standing, still human, but with a look of sorrow in his eyes. "The forest," he said softly, his voice filled with regret. "It has a hunger that consumes everything. It takes those who enter, binds them, and uses them to feed. But there's one thing it cannot do. It cannot take those who choose to leave. Emma's mind spun as the keeper continued. You have the power to break the cycle, he said. The forest will never stop, but you can end it. The keeper stepped back, fading into the light. The path before them cleared, the forest quiet once more. Emma stood in stunned silence, her heart racing. The forest had been trying to trap them, but it was done. The keeper had kept his promise. They had broken the cycle, and the forest, for the first time in years, was free. As the group made their way home, they knew that what they had experienced would never truly leave them. The memories would haunt them, and the whispers of the forest would echo in their minds forever. But for now, they were safe. And the forest, though dark and ancient, would never again claim another soul.